A lot of maps show roads as parallel black lines with white space in between. This technique, called casing, is good for making roads appear as areas rather than as edges. So here we've got this area that's white between two black lines. And if you add a subtle drop shadow to one side of that line like we do right here, the road seems to pop out of the page and suggest that the road surface is slightly raised from the ground. There are two ways to go about making cased roads, and which one you use depends on whether you're just representing road lines or whether you need to add areas like parking lots or this sort of pull out right here to the road surface. So if you're just drawing lines, casing is pretty easy and allows for maximum editability down the road. Come over to a new document here and make a new layer for my roads. And if I grab the pen tool and just draw some sample lines, I'm actually not going to add any stroke or fill to these lines yet. And it's important for this example that I show you an intersection, because what differentiates this technique from just adding a stroke or multiple strokes to each line is that at this intersection point, rather than the casing from one road going over the mouth of the other road, we get this circumstance where the roads sort of meet into each other, and you can actually sort of see the white space flowing from one road to the next, and the the casing, which would represent the curb, actually has a corner that just goes into the next road. So I guess I'll show you what I mean. If we were to add an appearance to each of these lines, where we added a new stroke that was pretty wide, and then another stroke that was white inside that was slightly thinner, we get this sort of overpass scenario where this road seems to just bypass this road by going over it, and we'd rather have the two sort of meet at this junction. So to solve that, I'm going to select both roads again, get rid of the strokes that I applied to them as individual paths, and come over and select the layer that they're in and apply. So I'm selecting the layer button there, and then I'm going to apply paths to the appearance of the layer. Oops, I only need two. So I'll make that bottom one, as I did earlier, a little bit wider, make this top one white and slightly smaller. And you can see that now that I'm applying those strokes to the layer that the paths are in, that appearance filters down to the paths that that layer contains, but it treats those paths inside the layer as a single object, and therefore draws the white stroke for all of those objects, and then goes and draws the black stroke for all of those objects below the white stroke that it's already drawn. And this is nice because we can still come back and change the paths of the roads. Everything is dynamic. Now, if we want to have a slightly more complex scenario where our roads are not only consist of these paths that have parallel sides, but also include these little bump outs for parking lots, or just slightly more complex polygon shapes, then we need to do something. We need to do something a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to start by just making a new layer. I'll call this roads with parking, and I'll turn off this original layer here. Okay, so if I grab, let's say I make a stroke there and another road like that. So we have two imaginary roads here, and I'd like to put a parking lot down on this end. In this case, I'm just going to give both of these strokes a bit of weight so that we can see the width of the road. And just for the sake of example, we can make one road a little bit larger road than the other. It's good to sort of develop a hierarchy of roads depending on whether they're, state highways or federal highways or just local roads. And so let's say that I want to put a bit of a parking lot down on this end of this road. All I'm going to do now, that I've got my roads drawn is take my pen tool and draw a shape with fill rather than with stroke. So I'll change this so that I've got black fill, and I'll just draw the shape of my parking lot. And I'll get the simplify tool out and just make that a little bit more rounded. Oops. Perfect. Okay, so now over in my road with parking lot layer, I've got two line paths that just have stroke, and then I have this other path that describes an area and that only has fill. And what I need to do in order to get all of these together so that I can put casing around them as a single object is expand them all. So if I select the whole layer and come up to Object and Expand, it'll ask whether I want to expand stroke or fill or both, and I'd like to expand both, so that my lines now become areas. And you can see that this path right here didn't change a lot because it was already being described as an area, but the paths that only had stroke are now being described as areas. They've got a path actually describing both edges of that line. Okay, so now if I was to select all these and come over and change my stroke to fill, you can see that we're getting there. These lines now have casing around them, but they're still overlapping each other where they intersect. So to fix that, we can select all of our objects and come up to Window and open the Pathfinder panel. And the Pathfinder panel has all these options for how we can overlay different shapes in order to create new shapes. The most basic of those options is this Unite tool. And what that will do is just take all of these shapes and where they overlap, unite them and turn them into a single sort of blob of a shape. So with everything selected here, I can go and click on the Unite button, and you can see that it dissolves those intersection points and turns this into a single path. So now we can control the stroke weight of that path. Maybe I'll tone that down to like 0.1 so that we've got sort of a subtle casing around that. But you can see that our intersections are nice and clean. We've got that white fill and then the casing that meets at the corners and continues along the next edge of the roadway. And similarly, our parking lot area is just sort of a continuous extension of that curb line. Now to add the slight drop shadow effect, I'm just going to select the path again and come up to Effect and Stylize and Drop Shadow. And I want this to be a really subtle effect. You can see if I click Preview, it's going to want to give me, you can just barely see that drop shadow, but it's sort of a fuzzy drop shadow. And I'd really rather have it be 100% opaque. I'm going to give it an offset of 0.1 point in both the X and Y axis with no blur. And I'm going to change the mode to normal. Multiply multiplies the colors by the coefficient of this opacity, and I'd really just rather have the drop shadow be straight black, so I'm going to change it to normal and hit OK. And finally, I'm just going to give that road surface a bit of a white fill so that we can't see the drop shadow off of the left line. We can only see it off of the bottom right line. And now if I zoom in, you can see that this is slightly darker than the one on the other side, giving the road this effect that it's sort of popping out of the page.